Engage. Disrupt. Adapt. Repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Wow, did we really have a great interview with Mark Wallace of the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy, Misty?
I think you did. He had a lot of really interesting things to say, and I saw a lot of parallels on what they're doing with the work in Detroit and the riverfront and how associations can learn from that.
I think that's so true that associations which have gotten a little insular in their thought process can really learn from what Mark shared about how you open up and you allow your opportunities to really become much greater than just yourself.
He had great things to say about how radical the public-private partnership was that they started, I think it was 11 or so years ago, and how that moved things forward in a way that surprised a lot of people, but they were willing to take that risk and forge new partnerships to move forward.
In fact, maybe not even surprised as much as made them uncomfortable, Misty. At the time, that was a really radical thought process. We tried so hard to keep those things separate. And yet, what we're beginning to learn is when we connect those types of different things in new ways, great new things result. Let's take a listen. Welcome to this edition of Pure Reinvention. We're here with Mark Wallace, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy. And I've got to tell you, as I've listened to the Detroit leadership and I've really began to recognize the story of the river in Detroit, I've been fascinated by its value in the reinvention process. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
You know, this whole reinvention experience, Mark, that we're going to talk about today really starts when we begin to understand some of the key structural components of an entity. In the case of Detroit and its municipality, the value of the Detroit River. Can you, Mark, share your background with the Detroit River, how you came to the Conservancy, and more importantly, how you began to discover the real role that the Detroit River plays in the city of Detroit?
Sure. So I moved to Detroit in 1999, straight out of college. And at that point in time, the Detroit River was still a very industrial space. As many people know, Detroit was founded at the river. Antoine Cadillac landed right outside of Hart Plaza back in the 1700s with Father Hennepin. There's some great quotes out of his diaries. Father Hennepin describes the bears as being less vicious than their counterparts in other parts of the world. And at that point in time, the river was really an amazing place. The shore was such that boats could dock there, but you didn't have to go through a significant swampland to get into the actual farmland. And historically speaking, the river was both the founding location of the initial Fort Wayne here, the location of the initial church in the area, and also the place where all the farms came to. Everyone needed access to that water, and everyone needed access to the animals that were trapped and harvested at the waterfront, too. So the river itself has a significant piece of history. When I showed up in Detroit, the river was still hearkening to a very industrial use. Immediately proximate to downtown in the central business district were two active cement silos. So all of the industry that you have associated with that, whether it's big piles of aggregate or whether it's large cement silos, were still active there. And you had the trucks rolling in and the trucks rolling out. You had barges and freighters that were coming up to load up on those materials. And it really felt like sort of, this industrial wasteland. Pretty close thereafter, a lot of different groups got together in the city and decided that the riverfront should be made a priority. And since then, it's been amazing to see what it's evolved into.
You know, so you bring up an interesting point, Mark, and that is the Detroit River became the reason that Detroit was founded here. It became the waterway or the travel path that we brought settlers up to. It became the focal point of how we moved goods and services in the 1700s, and actually remained kind of that same focal point for manufacturing goods and services up until just recently, when we looked at that space and thought maybe we ought to be doing something very different for it. So we spent hundreds of years looking at the Detroit River as a means to move goods and services in and out of the city of Detroit or its greater area.
That's right. If you look at every major city in the U.S. and most minor cities in the U.S. as well were founded at some waterway. If not a waterway, it was typically a train intersection where some sort of significant infrastructure came through. But in both cases, the water and the train tracks were considered to be sort of intersections of commerce and ways to move and circulate. So for years, the Detroit Riverfront was considered a place where industry happened and a place where goods and services could come and go. And in the past 10 or 11 years, we've radically transformed that, and it's been an amazing shift.
So at some point, there was a recognition that the purpose that the Detroit River had been utilized for may be needing to shift and maybe need to be repurposed or looked at in a very different way.
That's right.
Mark, can you share with us kind of the process that you were aware of, that people went through to be able to recognize that the way the river was that we were interacting with the river, it may be time for a change?
So the idea that the riverfront should become a significant public amenity is not a new idea in Detroit. It's an idea that's about 100 years old. And there were several groups that took good runs at it, made some plans, tried to gather support for that concept. But it wasn't until the founding of the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy that the riverfront really became a priority among the community. That took place around 11 years ago, and there were a series of things that led up to that. First, the city had assembled significant parcels of land in anticipation of welcoming casino gambling to the waterfront. Second, General Motors had purchased the Renaissance Center and made a massive investment in the Winter Garden, which really opened up the building toward the southern view of Canada and the Detroit River subsequently. General Motors invested a significant amount of money in building their plaza and their promenade. And that was really one of the first connections of the Riverwalk, which has turned into a 3.5-mile walkway and connected walkway. So the leadership of the city, in terms of taking that property, which ultimately did not house the casinos, but taking that property and turning it into developable land, investing in the street grid and the infrastructure, combined with General Motors' leadership in supporting the Riverfront Conservancy and donating their portion of the Riverwalk to the Riverfront Conservancy, those things really brought together some support. Those were also dovetailed with an amazing amount of philanthropic support, led by the Kresge Foundation, which provided its largest grant to the Riverfront Conservancy.
So what you're describing is once there was some initial investment made in the river, as you mentioned, from General Motors and some others, other people began to recognize the significance. And so when you roll back and look, a couple of key people started to make a real big difference in how we began to look at the river.
That's right. The city took leadership on building the street grid. The city took the leadership on taking down the cement silos. General Motors took the leadership on starting the construction for the riverfront. Kresge Foundation and just a laundry list of other foundations and philanthropic organizations and individuals came in behind them to really support what was being done there. As a result, you end up with what looks today like a miracle. You have 7 different property owners on the waterfront, including the U.S. Coast Guard, a gated community, a private hotel, a private office building. All of those property owners at the same time said, yes, it's important for the public to be here, and we're going to welcome the public to be on the waterfront. So instead of blocking their doors, instead of preventing people from coming to what's considered to be their most valuable part of the property, they said this is a place that belongs to the public, and it should be connected, and it should be managed by an organization such as the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy.
It's amazing to listen to you speak about how it kind of unfolded, because it reminds me of how we tend to see a lot of phase-ins of certain projects, where phase 1 leads to phase 2, leads to phase 3, and while it seems almost magical as you get through numerous phases, if you really go back and look at what some of the key trigger points are,
right,
they're actually very simple, that there were some very simple investments made, some new momentums were put in place. Once we got some of those momentums moving forward, others, including some key foundations in the city of Detroit, we were able to build that new momentum based on what everybody could begin to recognize was an extremely valuable asset to the city.
That's exactly right. And oftentimes it just takes 1 or 2 people to look at something and say, hey, let's look at this in a different way. And in this case, in the Riverfront's case, it was certainly General Motors and Kresge and the city of Detroit getting together and looking at it and saying, we have an incredible waterway, we have beautiful vistas, we have developable property. We need to really daylight this and make it an asset instead of just sort of the back door or the backyard of our city.
That's really amazing, because now instead of having to apologize for a river which is dirty, for fish that you can't eat out of the river, for these dirty cement silos that are kind of cluttering up our most valuable property, you now are describing a momentum where now we almost have some unlimited potential to continue to connect the city to the riverfront, and the more we connect, the more valuable the riverfront and the river becomes to the reinvention of Detroit.
Absolutely. And if you look at that momentum, it's interesting because it came largely from 2 places. On the land side, the Riverfront Conservancy was assembling the parcels to build the Riverwalk. The Riverwalk being a 3.5-mile connected pathway, promenade. It has lighting, security call boxes. We've covered the entire area with cameras, so we maintain a very high level of safety. We also do private landscaping and private security, so everything is very high standard in terms of park space. Simultaneous to that, there were a lot of folks who were working on actually improving the quality of the water itself. So the quality of the water improved almost simultaneous with the quality of the water's edge being improved. And that is a wonderful thing that those were both delivered around the same time. That the waterway was declared a National Heritage Waterfront, and there was a lot of federal support for it. Folks like John Hardig and other folks in town were very instrumental in really making it a wonderful place. So we're starting to see sturgeon habitats for spawning. We're starting to see bald eagles nesting along the Detroit River. It's remarkable to see the transformation that's happened.
I think that just you using the word remarkable kind of inspires me to think through not too long ago in how we looked at the river and how we look at it now, and how, the enthusiasm in your voice as you talk about a significant asset to the city and its unlimited potential. That once you get these initiatives rolling, it's really hard to describe what other initiatives will come forward, except they're all positive.
That's right.
Everything that's happening is in a positive way, and while in the past we had some negative examples starting to roll forward, now we're starting to have some very positive behaviors towards the river going forward.
Absolutely, and the transformation is really remarkable. I have a friend who owns one of the hotels in the Riverfront District, and he took one of his guests out to the waterfront. It was a person coming in from out of town. Said, hey, let me take a picture, and I'd like you to send this picture back to your friends back home and have them guess where you are today. And they're guessing, you're in this place, you're in that place, you're in Northern California, you're in Colorado. And it's like, no, I'm on the Detroit Riverfront, and that across the river from me is Canada, and I'm on this international boundary land. It's amazing to see that. It'll also be similarly amazing. Anyone who comes here today and experiences the water, I'd encourage them to take that same picture. Find what you think is some of the beauty of the riverfront and some of the industrial heritage. Take a picture of both of those together and come back 5 years later and see what's there. I think you'd be amazed to see the transformation.
The Detroit River is an amazing example of how in step 4 in the reinvention process we use the word connect, and the Detroit River is one of the major new connecting points, which is allowing the city to rebuild itself and reinvent itself, and this is one of its key components that as you're listening to Mark, you can see it starting to continue to build off of itself, to continue to build an outreach past the river to have a very positive effect on the city of Detroit. Mark, one of the new ideas that I want you to spend a few minutes and talk about is how this new momentum that you are creating with the Detroit Riverfront is starting to have a positive effect in other areas of Metro Detroit as well.
Sure. Well, I think there are really two things that the Riverfront has done. One is, in terms of physical connections, it's provided an actual tangible link to what's in my perspective the most beautiful physical attribute that we have. The Detroit River is deep, it's wide, it's across the river from Canada. We have Belle Isle on one side. The sun rises behind Belle Isle, the sun sets behind the Ambassador Bridge. So it's really, at all hours of the day, a beautiful, beautiful feature. That physical connection has been enhanced by other physical links which bring our riverfront guests back into their neighborhoods or from their neighborhoods down to the water. So we recently took an old train line called the DeQuinder Cut, which connects Eastern Market, which is one of our great assets in town, all the way to the waterfront. We converted that into a rails to trails, which is currently managed by the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy as well. So we're covering there with the same landscaping, the same security, the same amenity package that we provide. We have plans for other connections, such as the DeQuinder Cut on the west side as well, which would allow people from the southwest community, Mexican Town, Corktown, to actually come down to the water as well. So in terms of physical connections, we've really provided a place that gathers everyone. And our vision is that we would become and maintain the Riverwalk as a world-class gathering space, which is accessible and safe for all. And we really emphasize that as well. There are a lot of great cities in America and elsewhere that have different pockets of different types of people. And in Detroit, we have a tremendous diversity within our region and within our city. The Riverwalk has really become one of the special places in Detroit where everyone feels welcome, everyone feels like they belong, and everyone feels a sense of pride in our city. And it's amazing to see that transformation. I'll walk the Riverwalk and I will see a mother carrying a McDonald's bag, and she's got 3 little kids holding hands with each other going to one of our fountains. Coming the other direction is 3 or 4 old ladies who are talking to each other, and right behind them maybe a boyfriend and a girlfriend eating a scoop of ice cream with each other. It's really amazing to see the different folks who come together and what that means to them. So I think in terms of physical space, we've provided a gathering space that's really meaningful for our community. People from Detroit, people from outside of Detroit, millionaires who are coming to see General Motors and staying at the Renaissance Center. I mean, they're all out there, which is great. I think the other thing we've done in terms of moving the region forward is we've really demonstrated leadership in public-private partnerships. When you think about that concept of a public-private partnership, it's relatively familiar to us today. But the Riverfront Conservancy started 11 years ago. And the idea that we would say this space needs to be maintained at a high level, and we need support from the private community to allow this public space to exist, that was a relatively radical idea when the Riverfront Conservancy was founded. Since then, there have been several public-private partnerships that have rolled out, including Cobo Center Authority, which have really provided support for what we do here in the civic life in Detroit. So it's great to see the leadership that was demonstrated on the riverfront translate into other really significant assets of our community.
What you're really describing is that the Riverfront project started to teach people how to be much more collaborative in terms of how they work together. Not only collaborative socially, which you described with families and everyone feeling that they had access to the riverfront and how it made them feel, but that became a positive model, business model going forward for other entities to emulate after and to kind of you be the role model for, to show that a more collaborative understanding of how we move forward is probably in our long-term best interest as opposed to what our decision-making model was before. And as you mentioned, the Cobo Authority and how that has transformed Cobo, you can begin to see that both of those projects, both very collaborative in their decision-making and leadership, has absolutely been part of the cornerstone of the reinvention of Detroit.
That's right.
Mark, as ASAE is looking to come into Detroit in August of 2015, this year, they will be here at a time of the year when they will have the opportunity to experience the Riverwalk. Many of them will stay very close by. What would you encourage them to do while they are here so that they can begin to really experience this thing that you are describing to us?
Yeah. So every part of the Riverwalk is special, and we've tried very hard to have distinct areas of different activities. The ASAE conference will bring participants very close to sort of our heart location, from the Civic Center Promenade at Joe Louis Arena and Cobo Center, all the way down to the Renaissance Center. I'd really encourage folks who are coming into town for the first time to spend some time at the GM Renaissance Center, sitting on the steps right outside of the Ren Center. The Winter Garden is a great amenity. You can stop by and grab a little bite to eat in the food court, but just spend some time out there, and you'll see a lot of folks moving by. Out in front of the Renaissance Center, there's a wonderful fountain, and it's really become a place where kids from Grosse Pointe and the east side come together and play and splash water on each other and laugh and have a great time. I'd also encourage folks to take a little bit of a longer walk, maybe a 3/4 of a mile or half a mile down from the Renaissance Center to Rivard Plaza. And if you can get there at sunset, it's a beautiful place to be. We have boat docking there, so there'll be tours taking off and dropping people off.
Oh, so they can actually get on the water.
Sure, absolutely. So if you'd like to visit the water, you can join one of our Diamond Jack boat tours. But there's a little bit of food service there as well. We have butterfly gardens. We have a carousel, too. So if you get a chance to visit that, it's a really special place. We have a bike rental there as well, so if folks are interested in biking, seeing the DeQuinder Cut in a slightly different mode, it's a great thing to do. It's very, very simple. You can just walk in and take a bike with you. We also have a volleyball court as well, so there might be a pickup volleyball game you can get involved with. But it's just a wonderful place to experience. The first thing in the morning, during the day, and at sunset, it's really special.
You know, water for most people is a significant attraction. And to be able to see the Detroit River being used in a significantly different way is, congratulations to you and your group for doing that. If you're an executive coming to the ASAE event, I think it's really important for you to think about how the river has been repurposed in a way which has allowed Detroit to move forward on its path of reinvention. That, as Mark has described, it's the river and some other very significant assets which, when repurposed in a different way, has allowed the city to not only reinvent itself but have completely different deliverables. And I know that Mark is going to say that these are long-term and sustainable changes. These are not These are not cosmetic changes. These are deep cultural changes that will stay significant to the city of Detroit for a very long period of time. Yet they still have to be nurtured. They still have to be encouraged. That it's not fair to say that everybody understands how to be collaborative in their decision making. Not everybody understands the value of the Detroit River. It's a constant behavior that we have to exhibit on a real-time basis. But if you're an executive coming in and you're looking at some of these key cornerstones of what has allowed the city of Detroit to reinvent itself, this is step number 4 in the reinvention process. It's connecting the things that we have in a very different way to create the kind of outcomes that Mark has described. Mark, any final thoughts of the people of ASAE coming in August?
I think what you're going to find is that Detroit is a place where people have really learned how to work together. We've had a lot of hard times, and through those hard times, we've learned how to get projects done. I'd encourage everyone to identify in Detroit the assets such as the river, such as the waterfront, which are things that are so obvious in hindsight. And think about that in their own context. Go back to your community and say, hey, is there something we've been driving by for 100 years, ignoring, that could actually be turned into a really amazing public space? That's what we did here in Detroit on the waterfront, and our community is very, very proud of it. We think everyone will be very pleased when they see it.
Mark, thank you very much for your time today. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, www.purereinvention.com. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Misty, to do a recap on this, just so many things we could talk about, but what's the number one thing that you really felt that Mark taught associations here?
Oh, it's the looking at the river in a new way. It's driving by something for years and years and seeing it in one way. It served as a transportation and a road for commerce for so long, and then thinking, what else can we do with that?
I think that's so right. We used it as the Detroit River for so long as a means for moving goods and services up and down. And then all of a sudden, when we looked at it differently and said, how can we make this a public space? How can we let the general public enjoy the beauty of the water, which everybody enjoys the water, and how it then even grew to the point where it started to connect the neighborhoods, and they were able to take and make it an even broader attraction for more people to enjoy it is just a phenomenal story. I guess in looking back, I really like the fact that Mark talked about how we really had to learn to work together, that it wasn't a natural thing, that we created a rather radical new way in which we were thinking, creating this public-private partnership.
Sure, totally. And we hinted at it before the interview started, and I think it's worthy of talking about a little more, is that public and private partnership that they forged when it was uncomfortable for people. And how do associations do that? How do they know when it's the right time to take a risk? And I think that you don't know until you're in the space, but you need to take that opportunity to find out what can work for you. And it's probably in the most unlikely place.
I think that's right. We don't always want to do those things until it's way past the time that we should do them. And it is uncomfortable. It is really hard to do and create new habits. Yet look at what Mark has taught us, that we get such new and dramatically different results when we're ready to break out of those old habits and those old paradigms, and we're hungry for something new.
Right. I had the opportunity to take a yacht ride down the Detroit River not that long ago, and it's really breathtaking to be down there and see the transformation. I mean, I remember when it was a place you didn't want to be, not only because it wasn't pretty, but it didn't feel very safe. It didn't feel like an open and inviting area. And to see the transformation and be down there and be looking forward to going there to spend time with friends and family is very cool.
Yeah, and the momentum that they have now, which is not even just the small amount of investment that they've made from the downtown going towards Belle Isle, but as they complete that whole walkway going to Belle Isle, Mark will tell you they're already starting to purchase property, and they're already starting to work towards how do they go south towards the Ambassador Bridge, how do they create that same kind of momentum as it goes forward. So whether you're going up and down the river or whether you're now going into the neighborhoods through the DeQuinter Cut to Eastern Market, whether they open up pathways into other markets, how many more people are touched by the beauty and the energy of the river as opposed to when we used it as a commercial space.
Right, and Mark said something that really resonated with me and made me think, wow, associations can absolutely emulate this. And he said, we wanted a meaningful gathering space. And isn't that what associations do? don't they create a meaningful gathering space for people to learn from each other and connect?
I think they really could have not only that possibility, but I think the opportunity for them to do even more of that is so much greater. One of the things that's really impressed me about the new membership group coming in is how much they value that connection, but they want to be connected in a different way. And so much like the story of the Detroit River has taught us, there are great ways to connect people if you're willing to look at different ways to do that. A little uncomfortable at first, but I think the rewards, Misty, they'll find are well worth it.
Absolutely. What a pleasure to talk to him and hear what he has to say in the new ground that they've been forging. So if you want to tell us what you thought about the interview with Mark or share other Pure Reinvention stories, connect with us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention, find us on Facebook, or visit www.purereinvention.com.
If you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it Pure Reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.